All right, today we're going to talk about the endocrine system, specifically the workhorses of the endocrine system, which are hormones. So if you printed out the outline of the notes, you want to get those out and follow along as we go through this. The first thing that we'll talk about are why are hormones needed? So my slide is being slow, but it will come eventually, I promise. So why are hormones needed? And we'll be specifically talking about animals in this case. If you think about hormones and why they are needed, and animals are very large. They're multicellular. We need to communicate within our body. And so hormones are these chemical messengers that can go from one part of the body to the other part of the body and relay a message. And in doing so, that is effective communication, and it helps regulate homeostasis, which is that nice internal balance that all animals need to have. So some examples of how hormones can regulate homeostasis. The solute levels in the blood. Hormones do a great job of maintaining and regulating glucose levels, calcium levels, salts, etc. Also, metabolism and growth. If you think about how what you were like when you were a small child versus when you were adult, you were very different. All right, certain genes turned on, certain genes turned off. All of that was a reaction of hormones. They help regulate that. They also regulate your development and maturation as you get older, and then they're huge players in the role of reproduction. And so a woman that is pregnant and has a developing baby inside her has tons of hormones working and ensuring that that process is taken out properly. So the two systems that animals rely on for regulation are the endocrine system, which we'll be talking about more, and then the nervous system. And so the endocrine system, you can see right here on the right, it's a series. It consists of glands. And so here is your thyroid gland. It's a player in the endocrine system. Here are your adrenal glands. They sit on top of your kidneys. Here's the pancreas. All of these glands, what they do is they release hormones directly into the blood, and that's a very efficient way of doing that because your blood travels through all throughout your body, and it can get to its target tissue. Now, how does the target tissue know that it's a target tissue? And we talked about this when we talked about cell communication. If you have a chemical messenger and it's looking for its target tissue, it knows if it's the target tissue if it has that cell receptor. All right, so your target tissue will have a particular receptor very specific to the hormone that gets released. And because of that binding, you get a slow, long-lasting response. And so that's one of the systems that animals use for regulation. Another system that animals use for regulation is the nervous system. Down here we have the basic unit of the nervous system, and remember the nervous system is a system of neurons. All right, so this is a neuron. You should be familiar with the anatomy and how this works. And what they do is they transmit electrical signals along down the length of the axon. They get information from the environment or from another cell. They send electrical information down the length of their axons, and once they get to the synaptic terminal, that electrical signal switches over to a chemical signal. And that chemical signal is our neurotransmitters. And those neurotransmitters can then bind to the target tissue. And the nervous system is a fast, short-lasting response. So these two systems are super important for animals to maintain regulation. And again, regulation, the chemical messengers are going to be the ones that's going to help regulate animals' bodies. And so for the nervous system, the chemical messengers are neurotransmitters. And so here is your neuron. A electrical signal is sent down the length of the axon. At the very end, you have these little red dots, which are your neurotransmitters. They are stored in these vesicles. And these vesicles, when prompted, what they'll do is they'll fuse with the membrane and get dumped out into the synapse. And then they will go and they will bind to the receptor proteins that are very specific to that neurotransmitter. For the endocrine system, remember it's a series of glands. What they do is they release hormones. All right, so hormones are the chemical messengers for the endocrine system. Neurotransmitters are the chemical messengers for the nervous system. Hormones get dumped into the bloodstream. They travel throughout the bloodstream, and they know that this is their target tissue because the target tissue, again, has a receptor specific for that hormone. All right, and that's just step one, is signaling. What this cell does depends on the type of cell machinery, and it also depends on the chemical messenger itself. So again, the endocrine system uses the blood to transport that hormone, and that hormone will have a receptor on its target tissue. All right, so there's two different classes of hormones. There's protein-based hormones and there are lipid-based hormones. So we can take all these hormones and we can throw them into two classes, and these two classes behave differently. Some examples of protein-based hormones. We have polypeptides, which are very small, insulin, and then ADH, the antidiuretic hormone. Be familiar with their role. And they're very, very tiny. Glycoproteins, these are larger proteins, and that glyco means that there's a sugar attached. And so these large proteins with a carbohydrate, follicle-stimulating follicle-stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone, those are going to play a huge role in the development of gametes, sperm and egg, for males and females. Amines are your modified amino acids, epinephrine, melatonin, which helps regulate our sleep-wake cycles. They are all protein-based hormones, and because they're protein-based, they're going to behave a little bit differently than the lipid-based hormones. Your lipid-based hormones are steroids, and your steroids are going to be your modified cholesterol. Your sex hormones, things like testosterone, estrogen, progesterone, those are all lipid-based hormones. And because they're lipid-based, they're going to behave very differently than the protein-based hormones. And so these are the two classes. How do they actually work on their target cells? Well, lipid-based hormones are small. They're nonpolar. All right? So they are hydrophobic. They're lipid-soluble, they're small and nonpolar, so what they can do is they can diffuse directly across a cell membrane, no problem. Because if you think about a cell membrane, the internal part of that cell membrane is made up of lipids. And so these lipids-based hormones have no problem diffusing directly across it. So something that you need to remember is that the receptor for lipid-based hormones is on the inside of the cell. All right, these things are going to diffuse across the membrane, and they're going to bind to the receptor on the inside of the cell. You're going to find that receptor in the cytoplasm or nucleus. What it does is once it hooks up with that receptor, that hormone receptor complex goes into the nucleus where it binds to a promoter region on DNA and act as a transcription factor. And if you think about what transcription factors do, you should already know. But what they do in eukaryotes, and remember again, we're talking about animals, so we're talking about eukaryotes. What they do is they provide a nice little seat for RNA polymerase to come and bind to. And so that in turn is going to basically turn on genes. Okay, so these lipid-based hormones are going to turn on genes, but again, know how they work. Protein-based hormones, on the other hand, are hydrophilic, meaning water-loving. They're going to be polar, and they're going to be a little bit larger. They're not lipid-soluble, and because of that, they cannot diffuse across the cell membrane. So their receptor is in a different place. Their receptor is on the surface of the cell. So their receptor is anchored in the cell membrane. Once they bind to that receptor, they're going to initiate a signal transduction pathway, or a secondary messenger pathway. So we're going to review cell communication in a second. Hopefully that should be a review to you. So they'll trigger the secondary messenger pathway, and then that's going to elicit some sort of internal cellular response. And it depends on the hormone, it depends on the cell's machinery, and the same hormone can have different types of cell responses depending on the machinery. And so some examples of internal cellular responses are enzymatic action, uptake or secretion of molecules. All right, so insulin is a protein-based hormone. What it does is it signals cells to intake glucose from the blood. All right, and so it's going to bind onto a receptor on the surface of the cell membrane and do that. So memorize the action of lipid hormones. Now, if you think about lipids, they're hydrophobic. How do hormones travel throughout the body? They travel throughout the body through the bloodstream. Now, if you think about the bloodstream, your bloodstream is mostly water. And because it's water, these lipids are going to have a hard time traveling through that blood because they are nonpolar, water is polar, the blood is polar, and if you remember from chemistry, like substances dissolve in like substances. So what this is going to need is an assistant. All right, this is going to need a protein carrier, and that's super important for you to remember. These things cannot travel in the bloodstream by themselves. They need assistance. And so this protein carrier has a little nice hydrophobic pocket for that to sit in, but it itself is hydrophilic, so it has no problem traveling through that bloodstream. So the steroid hormone has a protein carrier, it travels through the bloodstream, and the steroid can exit anytime it wants to. And so this binds and unbinds and binds and unbinds and binds and unbinds, and it knows that it's reached its target cell, because when it diffuses across the membrane, because it's small and nonpolar, once it diffuses across the membrane, it's going to hook up with this receptor. All right, and once it does that, this steroid hormone complex, the hormone receptor complex can go in through the nuclear pore, and then once it's inside the nucleus, this thing can bind to DNA. And it's not just going to bind to any old place, it's going to bind to a promoter region for a specific gene. So it binds to that promoter region. It's going to recruit RNA polymerase. RNA polymerase is going to come and transcribe that gene. It's going to turn on that gene, turn on transcription. And if you think about what transcription produces, you should already know. It produces mRNA. All right, so that's what's going to make. mRNA, messenger RNA, is going to leave through that nuclear pore. It's going to go out into the cell. It's going to hook up with a ribosome, whereby that ribosome will read that mRNA and translate it into a protein. Now this protein, depending on the particular lipid hormone and depending on the particular cell, might produce a particular protein. This protein could be secreted. All right, it just depends on the particular hormone in question. But this is the general action of a lipid hormone. And so please know how that happens and how it actually turns on genes. All right, so protein hormones are going to be a little bit different. All right, remember, they have no problem traveling through the blood because they're both hydrophilic. So they're going to travel through the blood once they get released by their endocrine gland, and they will find their target cell because their target cell has the receptor for the hormone. So here's your target cell. There's your plasma membrane. Here's your cytoplasm. Your receptor protein, notice that it's anchored within the cytoplasm. So your hormone binds to that receptor. What it does, if you look at this, this should be familiar to you. Think back to cell communication. What type of receptor is this? If you said G protein coupled receptor, you are correct. This is a G protein receptor. What it's going to do, it's going to bind to that, and that's going to be step one in cell communication. All right. What it does is once it binds to the G protein receptor, it's going to activate cytoplasmic signals. And a G protein coupled receptor is going to take GTP, activate a G protein, which then in turn activates some sort of enzyme. And this enzyme will take ATP and make cyclic AMP. So this particular enzyme, because it's making ATP and making cyclic AMP, is adenyl cyclase. The cyclic AMP is acting as a secondary messenger. It's a secondary messenger because it's not the first messenger, which is the hormone, but also it's a secondary messenger because it is not a protein. The cyclic AMP is going to activate enzymes, which will activate another enzyme. And remember, activating an enzyme and activating another enzyme, that's all done by phosphorylation. So ATP is needed for this step. It's going to take off a phosphate group from that ATP and activate an enzyme, and then that one in turn will take another ATP, take that phosphate and activate another enzyme, and it eventually gets to the point, and these are called protein kinases. This whole step after signal is called transduction. All right, so this is step one in cell communication. This is step two. This should all be familiar to you. And step three is basically when your cell produces some sort of action. What sort of action can it produce? Well, it depends. It depends on the actual signaling molecule and the cell's machinery. But that's a general case of protein hormones. So the specific example that you need to know about is epinephrine. Epinephrine is, the common name for that is adrenaline. It's a huge player in the fight or flight response. So the liver cell is one of the many targets of adrenaline. So you need to know this specific example of the liver cell in adrenaline. The receptor is located in the cell membrane. Remember, epinephrine is a protein-based hormone. It's not going to be able to diffuse across the membrane. So it's going to bind to a receptor in the cell membrane. It's going to be secreted first, though, through the adrenal gland, which is this yellow thing right here. It's sitting on top of the kidney. And so this is going to get a signal from some nerves to secrete adrenaline into the bloodstream. Now, how does that do that? Well, let's say you see something very scary. All right, so information from the environment travels along your optic nerve into your brain, where it signals the hypothalamus, which we'll talk about in a second. And the hypothalamus is going to stimulate neurons to this adrenal gland. Neurotransmitters are going to bind to this adrenal gland and say, hey, you need to secrete adrenaline, and it's going to secrete your adrenaline into the bloodstream. There it goes. Once it finds the liver, it's going to bind to a G protein coupled receptor. All right, G protein coupled receptors takes GTP and activates this G protein right here. This G protein will then in turn activate adenyl cyclase. Adenyl cyclase takes ATP and converts it into cyclic AMP. All right, so it took off two phosphates at the end, so it went from a triphosphate to a monophosphate, and it made a nice little ring. All right, so that's why it's the cyclase, makes a cyclic molecule. That cyclic AMP is going to be your secondary messenger, where it activates different protein kinases by phosphorylating them. All right, and all that takes ATP. And at the very end, it's going to activate glycogen phosphorylase. That's an enzyme where it's going to take glycogen, and again, all this is transduction after the first one. It's going to take glycogen, which, if you remember the function of glycogen, the function of glycogen is energy storage. It's a polymer of glucose. These little alpha glucose subunits are strung together, and they're helical, so they're compact. They hang out in the liver to be used later. All right, so in the case that epinephrine binds to it, we need this stored energy. So this glycogen, once this binds, it's going to activate glycogen phosphorylase. Glycogen phosphorylase is going to take that stored glycogen, break it up into glucose subunits. Then what it's going to do is those glucose subunits are going to get dumped out into the bloodstream, where the muscle cells can take in that glucose and use it to make ATP via cellular respiration, because when you see something scary, you might have to run away, you might have to fight someone, but you're going to need energy on demand. And so that's why your blood sugar increases, so your muscles can take that sugar in and break it down into ATP. And so releasing this to the blood, that is the cell response. And so the signal is epinephrine binding. Transduction is everything that happens after that up to the response, and the response is releasing glucose to the blood. So know that specific example. So the nervous system and the endocrine system are the two systems animals rely on for communication, and they do so through feedback models. And so in this particular case, we're going to talk about the nervous system controlling body temperature. And so we are endotherms. We maintain an internal body temperature of 37 degrees Celsius. That's about 98.6 degrees Fahrenheit. And so we like that. This is our target set point. So when our body temperature gets too high, what's going to happen is sensory neurons from the environment tell your brain, you're hot. It's too hot. So the master nerve control gland, or it's not really a gland, but the master nerve control center is your hypothalamus. That is that's the internal sort of thermostat in your brain. It gets messages from the environment that it's too hot. And so what it's going to do is it's going to stimulate nerve signals. It's going to generate action potentials along particular types of neurons that go to your skin. All right, and so those particular types of neurons, a set of them are going to stimulate the sweat glands, and they're going to cause them to release liquid onto the surface of your skin. Releasing liquid, which is mostly water, onto the surface of your skin is going to, what sweating does is it's supposed to cool you down. All right, when you release water onto your skin, that water is going to take some of that energy and remove it as it evaporates. And so this is evaporative cooling. It's supposed to cool you down. That's really hard during the summer of Georgia because the air is already saturated with water, so the water doesn't tend to evaporate as it would, say, like out west. So there's a bundle of nerves that are going to stimulate sweat glands to help cool you down and bring you back down to this target set point. Also, there's going to be another bundle of nerves that go, and they're going to dilate the blood vessels that are close to the surface of your skin. So it's going to increase the diameter of those blood vessels. What that does is, because there is more blood flowing to the surface of your skin, that blood is carrying a lot of heat. All right, and so once it gets close to the skin, it's going to leave, that heat is going to leave the blood and enter the environment. So you're losing heat to the environment. And that also is supposed to help cool you down. And this is why when you're hot, you sweat and you look flushed. All right, your face might be a little red. And so because of this high body temperature, your hypothalamus is going to do its job and bring you back down to that target set point. All right, if your body temperature gets too low, again, your hypothalamus, your internal thermostat, which is located in your brain, is going to stimulate a different set of nerves, which are going to do two things. One of those things is shivering. All right, and so everyone should probably be familiar with this. What shivering does is it's supposed to warm you up. And how it warms you up is that when you shiver, you're actually hydrolyzing your ATP stores. So your ATP, that very last phosphate on an ATP molecule, tends to break off when you're shivering. So when you're shivering, that terminal phosphate breaks off. And when it breaks off, a lot of energy is released. That energy that is released is absorbed by the surrounding cellular environment, which is mostly water, and that's going to increase your internal temperature. So shivering breaks down ATP. That energy from that breaking down ATP is absorbed into the cells, and it's going to warm you up. So you're depleting all your ATP stores when you're shivering, and so therefore your respiration rate is going to increase when you are cold, because since you're breaking down all your ATP, your cells need to replace that ATP. And how do they replace their ATP? They do that by breaking down glucose. So they're breaking down glucose to restore that. And so that's why you actually have a higher rate of respiration in lower temperatures than you do in higher temperatures. So shivering is going to help warm you up. Also, a different set of nerves are going to go, and they're going to constrict the blood vessels near the surface of the skin. They're going to constrict it, make it a smaller diameter, so less blood flows to your skin, and you maintain more heat in your body. Okay, so less blood flowing, meaning less heat lost to the environment. That's why sometimes when people are very cold, they look sort of pale. Because those nerve signals are stimulating the constriction of those blood vessels. And so if you think about what sort of feedback model this is, where you have a particular target set point, and if you get too high, something happens to bring you back down, and if you get too low, something happens to bring you back up. That is a negative feedback model. All right, the endocrine system, also a major player in regulating homeostasis. And so the example that you need to know about is the regulation of blood sugar. And so what the endocrine system is going to do is your blood sugar has a target set point of 90 milligrams per 100 milliliters of blood. So if your blood sugar gets too high, which could happen after you eat like a big meal, your pancreas, which is going to be the gland in the endocrine system, what it's going to do is it's going to release a hormone. In this case, it's going to release insulin. And the insulin is secreted from the pancreas, and that pancreas is going to dump out insulin. But specifically, the islets of Langerhans beta islet cells within the pancreas is going to secrete insulin. Insulin, remember, this is a hormone. It gets released into the blood. And what it's going to do is it's going to bind to target cells and induce the uptake of glucose from the blood, effectively lowering that blood sugar. All right, and so the major organs that are going to take in that sugar from the blood are the liver. They're going to hold on to those glucose, and they're going to bind all those little glucose molecules together and form glycogen to be stored at a later date. Also, your muscle cells do that as well. Your liver is the main one that stores glucose in the form of glycogen. Also, what insulin is going to do is it's going to reduce your appetite. So if you're eating and your blood sugar gets very high, you don't eat forever. You stop eating once your appetite is satiated. And so insulin plays a role in that. And so that's when your blood sugar gets too high, insulin's going to help bring you back to that normal set point. Now let's say your blood sugar gets too low because you're hungry. So the same gland is going to play a role in this, the pancreas. It's going to secrete a different type of hormone. It's going to secrete glucagon. Now, people get this confused with glycogen. Glycogen is a carbohydrate that stores glucose. Glucagon is a hormone. It's a protein-based hormone. It's secreted by the islets of Langerhans alpha islet cells. What it's going to do is, once it goes into the bloodstream, it's going to bind to liver cells. That's its target cell. It's going to bind to liver cells, and it's going to do the same thing epinephrine does. It's going to tell the liver cells, hey, break down glycogen, release glucose into the bloodstream. And because of that, it's going to bring that glucose level back up to its target set point. Glucagon also is going to trigger hunger. All right, so if your blood sugar gets too low, you get hungry. All right, and so you probably have had that experience before, and so you need to eat more as well to sort of replenish the glucose that your liver just lost, to increasing your blood sugar to get to that target set point. So that's also another negative feedback model, because you're dancing around this target set point. All right, last thing is just sort of a review. The hypothalamus, which I talked about before, it's like your internal thermostat. It's your master nerve control center. It doesn't just do body temperature, it does a lot of other things, but it is your master nerve control center. It's sort of like where all these sort of sensory neurons from the environment, they go and they talk to the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus sort of makes decisions about what it needs to do in order to coordinate your body. And so it's a part of the nervous system. It receives information and then decides what to do about it. But it also can release hormones, and those hormones can go to the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is sort of like the boss of the endocrine system. It's also located in the brain. It's right next to the hypothalamus. So this right here is your brain, and then you can see your hypothalamus is here, and then here's your anterior and posterior pituitary gland. What this does, the pituitary gland, is it secretes, it's part of your endocrine system, but the hypothalamus sort of talks to it. In a sense, it talks to it through chemical messengers, these hormones. And the pituitary glands, once it receives those hormones, it's getting information from the environment, it can secrete a broad range of hormones into the bloodstream that have various target tissues. And so if you look in your book, several hormones are released by the anterior and posterior pituitary gland, and they have different target tissues. And so what those hormones do is help regulate other parts of the body. So these two systems, although they're very different, they are not completely mutually exclusive. They do rely upon each other. So I hope that was helpful. If you have any questions whatsoever about anything that I talked about, please ask me in class, and I would be happy to answer you.